All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Independent Podcast. My name is Fernando Garcia, and I'm joined with my guests, Evan Johnson and Kathy Molig from Trans Family Support Services. Hopefully I pronounced your last name right. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for being a guest on my podcast here. I'd like to start off the conversation if both of you can, or maybe one of you explain what Trans Family Support Service is about, and then also explain how you got involved in the organization itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start and then I'll pass it to Evan. So, yes, my name is Kathy Molig, she, her, my pronouns. I am the executive director and founder of Trans Family Support Services. I am also the parent of a trans person. My son started his transition over a decade ago. And back then, most people didn't even know what the word meant, much less that it affected young children.
Yeah.
And so, where we live locally, we had no doctors who were willing to treat him. Schools had no idea how to best support him. And so, as I was advocating for his needs in those spaces, others' families came along and asked if I would help them with their kids. And I did that for a few years. And then 8.5 years ago or so, started the organization. And to date, we have served over 4,000 trans individuals and their families across the country.
Wow.
So we're based in Southern California. We serve nationally, and we have a chapter in Alabama. We offer direct services to trans individuals up to age 30 and their families. We also help adults in accessing medical, gender affirming medical care. So we have all kinds of support groups that we do and other programs. I'll let Evan share about our youth programming because that's their realm.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'm Evan. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the director of youth programming at Trans Family. I got involved with the organization because 8 years ago, when I was a senior in high school, I was the president of our GSA. I was in a similar geographic area to where Kathy is located and was starting out this work. And it was a little bit less of an open and affirming environment for LGBT people as a whole, not just trans and non-binary folks. And so I'd always kind of had this perception that once you graduate, you're going to have to stop doing this, right? You're going to have to stop being yourself. And thankfully, Kathy came in and visited with our GSA, and we got connected, and I started volunteering pretty much that summer with the organization, and it's just grown since then. So I've been in various positions with the org for about 7 years now, and pretty much built up what our youth programming looks like. So like Kathy mentioned, we define youth as anyone 30 or under, because we see that there's a significant gap in services for that 25 to 30 range. And so we include them in our young adult programming. And that, like Kathy said, it includes peer-to-peer support groups, moderated and safe Discord servers for folks to get access to each other between meetings and to form stronger communities. We also do mentorships. We help folks get access to apparel items that make them feel more authentic and comfortable in their identities and bodies, all sorts of things. Basically, anything that a trans person or their family could be looking for in services, we do our best to provide.
So would it also be, so if it's either a child or a youth themselves can contact you, or their families can reach out to you if they have questions, or obviously I'm pretty sure this is a new thing for most people, especially for families. Not to say obviously transgender people have always been around.
Yes.
It's just a matter of, and I guess in American culture and Western culture, I guess you could say, we're now kind of finding out how to deal with it. I guess
there's definitely more visibility and more openness across our country. One of the things that we're seeing is when it comes to our adolescents and our young kids is that we have a generation of parents that are leaning into these conversations with kids and listening to them when they tell them this is who I am, this is how I feel. Where I think, previous generations of parents were like, if a child said, oh no, I'm not a boy, I'm really a girl, the parents would be like, oh no, you're not, silly, and shut that conversation down.
Mhm.
And that's not necessarily what's happening today, because of some amazing visibility that has happened over the last 10 years or so, that opens up that space for these conversations within family units.
Yeah. And I kind of want to, for some people, kind of dumb down the conversation a little bit. What if I came, what is a trans person? If I could ask, is there an easy definition for that?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So when we're talking about the trans community, the broadest definition of transgender is any person whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So that can mean lots of different things for lots of different people. Some people include identities like non-binary within the trans umbrella, where some folks think of these as two separate things. We use non-binary to describe gender identities which are not exclusively male or female. So there's lots of language that falls under that as well. And then something to just note and add to the conversation, since we have a word like transgender to describe folks whose gender identities are different, we also have the word cisgender, CIS gender, used to describe people whose gender identities are the same as their sex assigned at birth. So like Kathy is a cis person and I'm a trans person. And so it's important that we have both of those words defined as we start these sorts of conversations, because if we're only defining transgender, we're really othering the trans experience. And like what you mentioned earlier, trans people have always existed. So it's helpful and important for us to have both of those words.
Yeah. And then another question too, in terms of the term non-binary, what can you give me an example? I think that I do have an understanding of trans person, but non-binary, I've heard that thrown around. What's an example of that?
Yeah. So for example, I'm a non-binary person, right? I specifically identify with the label agender, which means neither male nor female. And for myself, what non-binary means is it's this separation from male and female identities. And it really comes from a place of personal experience and personal identity. But what we can see historically is that there had always been this kind of broad spectrum of gender identities. It was never really confined to just men and just women until British colonization. But when we look at like indigenous communities of North America, when we look at the indigenous populations of Hawaii, when we look at pre-colonization in India, in Africa, in most of Asia, we see identities that fall outside of that male-female binary. And so we would consider all of those under this umbrella term of non-binary.
Right now, got it. And then let me ask you another question. This is going to be like a broad statement. Why is it important for us to care about trans rights?
I mean,
I know. I mean, it might be. I get. I'm trying to look at it from a different perspective to say, hey, why should non-trans people care about these rights? Why is it so important? What would you say to that? If for somebody asking that question?
So there are a couple of things that come to mind, right? I'm a social worker by education. And so for me, like one of my core values is just the inherent value of every human life, right? So on the one end, there's that piece of all people have value. And so we should care about the experiences and the things that are happening to all marginalized communities, because that's showing a disvaluing of certain people for identities that they hold. Sure. And that just inherently goes against what I believe to be true of the world. Right. The other thing, though, is that a lot of these conversations around trans rights and access to trans care and the experiences that we all are having as a community, these things directly do impact the cisgender community. And I think one of the biggest ways that we have seen that come up as of late is this piece of athletes, right? Whereas there's been a lot of skepticism and a lot of criticism of trans athletes participating in sports, we're also seeing cisgender athletes who are being barred from sports because now there's very select scrutiny around what is biologically male and what is biologically female. And so we're starting to see this impact more than just the trans community. So there's that humanist part of the world that's going to really resonate with the fact that all humans have value, all humans have worth. And then some people who need to understand how these issues impact them directly And
Sure.
that's one of those ways of none of these topics are going to just stop at trans people, because that's really hard to define where that line is. These are things that are going to access, or that are going to impact access for all people.
I want to bring in one other perspective, and we see this often when we're at out at conferences and such,
Mhm.
is that, parents who didn't know about their child's gender identity yet, whether
Mhm.
it's an adolescent, young adult, or whatever, and we're not informing themselves about the rights of trans people, and then their kids come out to them, their kids
Mhm.
share this really intimate information about themselves, and they're devastated at the things they had said previously about
Mhm.
the trans community in general.
Yeah.
And the more we as a cisgender population push back against the trans population, the more we repost things or say things that we're just doing because we don't know any better or we don't know any different, we are causing harm to other people that could, in fact, be people we love.
Mhm.
And so being aware of, we don't get to just claim our uneducatedness. And well, I didn't know. Well, why didn't you know? Why aren't you leaning in? This is why this program is so important, to help
Yeah.
educate more people.
Yeah. No, you had brought up the sports issue, and that's something I do want to get into, but I'll kind of, before I get into that, one other issue too that I've noticed a lot of is the issue of pronouns. Kind of wanted to, I mean, from my perspective, I'm 43, going to be 44. Most of my life, I've never, felt compelled to say my pronoun. It was never an issue. And now I'm seeing it more and more. Um, and is it something that people should do? If so, why? If they don't do it, is it a sign of disrespect, or is it? I mean, I guess what is so important about the pronoun, and should people be putting their pronoun, and also when somebody says they them, if you can clarify what that also means, I'd appreciate it too.
Yes. Okay. Many questions, many things,
Yeah.
but I'm excited by it. So,
Yeah.
a little background about me, just because you'd opened this box.
Okay.
Before I was a social worker, I was an archaeologist focusing in linguistics. So I was focusing in language and the evolution and development of language and culture. So I can go really far into pronouns, but we're going to keep it kind of concise and kind of small here. So first of all, pronouns, just like grammar lesson wise, this is the third person language that we use to refer to another individual, right? We all use pronouns. We also have like second person pronouns, right? So like you, I, these are pronouns as well. The reason why pronouns have become so much more visible is because we're seeing an increased visibility of the trans community, yes, but we're also seeing increased representation of folks who we would call gender nonconforming. And that's folks who are people who don't present their gender in the same way that is typically expected in our society. Think people like Billy Porter, who wears ball gowns to like red carpet events. Billy Porter is a cisgender man who continues to identify as a man, but wears dresses. And so as we're seeing this increase in gender nonconformity, and we're seeing this increase of visibility for the trans community, we're recognizing as a society that we can't assume a person's pronouns anymore just by looking at them. We never could, but it's just becoming really relevant and really visible to us now. When we talk about pronouns and the language we're using and why we should be identifying our pronouns beyond just this piece of we can't assume a person's pronouns, when we say our pronouns as an individual, we're giving another person the tools to refer to us correctly. So I really like to compare it to like saying my name. And so like take like random scenarios, circumstance, say you are seeing a doctor for the first time. And there are 3 doctors who all work out of the same office. And when you scheduled the appointment, you didn't get the doctor's name. You just said, hey, I just need your soonest appointment. They're like, okay, great. Here's your doctor. So you're going to do the intake form. On the intake form, you have to fill out your name because they need that so that they can look at like your insurance information. You hand in that form and they say, okay, great. Your doctor will see you soon. The nurse comes out. The nurse calls you by name. okay, you respond because you know what your name is. And you go into the examination room and the nurse says, the doctor will see you soon. Now, all this time, I still don't know my doctor's name. Okay. So like, that's weird, but I just assume the doctor's going to introduce themselves with their name when I meet them. And then the doctor gets in and immediately starts talking about like that weird mole on my back that I'm in to get checked out right now, and like never says their name. And then says, okay, I need to see you in 6 weeks. But I don't know your name, right? And I never got a good opportunity to ask because like, oh my God, it'd be so awkward. We've been talking for an hour now about this very intimate thing. And I don't know your name. And so I'm going to go back to the front desk and I'm going to say, I need to schedule an appointment in 6 months, in 6 weeks or whatever. And now I'm stuck because I could describe what my doctor looked like. I could try really hard. Well, they were wearing a white coat. They had a stethoscope, but there's 2 other doctors who practice out of the same room. Mm-hmm. So it's much easier if I have a person's name. In that same vein, it's much easier to navigate social circumstances if we have a person's pronouns. And because we can't assume a person's pronouns, well, it's easiest if they just tell us. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's very much this piece why introducing yourself with your pronouns has become such a big thing. This isn't giving any sort of vulnerable information when we use our pronouns. A lot of people want to compare it to like, well, then I'm telling you like more information about me than I'm willing to give. Like, so is telling a person your name, right? When I tell you my name, you can now look me up. If I were your doctor, you could look up malpractice suits against me, previous hospitals that I've worked at, where I got my degree. It's the same level of information when we tell someone our pronouns. So it's very surface level information. And so if we're not doing that, I mean, it's a very clear indicator to those of us within the community that you don't see us and you don't recognize us. For myself as a non-binary person who never gets my pronouns assumed correctly, because that's not where our culture is as a society, I know I'm not going to be received in that space. So we as a community, we need our allies to be identifying themselves with their pronouns so that we can recognize them as allies. And so we start changing the tide in recognizing this is just as surface level as a name. And then I answer your last part of that question. What does it mean when someone uses they, them pronouns? Right. So they, them is the gender neutral singular pronoun we have accessible to us in the English language. We've thought of it for many years as exclusively a plural pronoun, but we've used the singular version of they since the 1300s. So that's all that it is. It's just, I don't identify with he, him pronouns. I don't identify with she, her pronouns. My next option in the English language for me was they, them. That's not necessarily true anymore of the mainstream English language, but those are like the main 3 pronouns that we talk about.
So is it an assumption that if I hear somebody say they, them, that they're non-binary? Would that kind of be, is that typical or not?
I guess. So pronouns are part of a person's gender expression. So it would be like wearing an article of clothing. Most people who use they, them pronouns are non-binary because it is a non-gendered pronoun. But I do know some cisgender individuals who will use the they, them pronoun to normalize the experience.
Gotcha. Let me go back to the playing sports. And really, I kind of find that the issue of the sports issues traditionally with trans women. So not, nobody typically is worrying about trans men in sports, but more trans women. And, I do, my concern would, if I was a woman, and I'll give you an example between me and my wife, I'm naturally stronger than her, and if we were, if I was in a sport that required strength, it could be, fighting, it could be rugby. I come from a rugby background, so there's women rugby teams, women MMA, women boxing. Couldn't that be like? I don't know if there's like a stance on it, but I guess is it fair that these trans women who were born male could actually compete in these sports? Is that, and if so, why? I think that, I think a lot of people are trying to wrap their head around why is that fair? Obviously, if I walk onto a basketball court and Shaquille O'Neal, we're both men, but he's obviously got a natural advantage, right? So even within, males, we all have our different advantages, but is that how it's viewed in terms of the sports? Like, hey, we all have advantages over each other, and that's just the way it is. And even if somebody was born a male, that shouldn't exclude him. Is that kind of the take?
I think there's a couple of things to look at with sports, and Evan certainly is going to have some other things to add. But I think we have to first look at, this comes up around sports in schools, right?
Mhm.
Our younger kids, our minors playing sports, and recognizing, why do our students play sports? They play sports so that they can make friends. They can learn things like leadership and team building skills, so they can build their own confidence. Like, why would we want to block that from a middle schooler or a high schooler, right? This isn't about elite athletes. You pegged that one really well. Elite athletes all have some kind of advantage,
Mhm.
right? So we don't want to compare that there. And also that piece of, you talked about, people don't seem to care about trans guys. There was a wrestler in Texas during high school who had started his medical transition. And so he was then forced, because of Texas law, this was a few years ago, because of Texas law, he was forced to continue to wrestle girls.
Mhm.
He was completely undefeated his senior year of high school. How was that fair to any of the girls on the mat?
So,
Right?
to clarify,
It's,
if you don't mind, I just want to clarify. So he was born a woman or female.
So
he was assigned
I would say I want to
female
make
at
a
birth.
correction on
Okay, okay.
language
Yes.
here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Language is really important in being respectful of any kind of culture, right? So we don't say born in the wrong body. We don't say born a girl. He was assigned female at birth. His gender identity is male.
Okay. So yeah. So and forget, this is, I'm going to probably make a few mistakes. So forgive
That's
me.
okay.
We love that.
So
And hopefully you feel us gently correcting, because that's how we like to come across.
yes. So this person was assigned as a female, and then continued to wrestle with other females, and
Was forced to continue to wrestle
Mhm.
females, even though he identified as a male and had started a transition. The Texas state law required that he continue to wrestle females.
and he was getting, I'm assuming, since he was going through transition, he was going through testosterone and getting all those other things that would make him a better wrestler.
That would make him male.
Would make well, yes, but male. But the reason I say the testosterone levels
would give him an unfair advantage
Unfair
against
advantage,
assistants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
Exactly. Evan,
Okay.
go ahead and take.
I
the rest
have
of
lots
it.
of thoughts and feelings around sports. I was a high school and college athlete. I played water polo.
Okay.
And so, and like Kathy mentioned with this piece of, when we're talking about youth athletics, I'm very transparent in the fact that my ability to participate in water polo saved me from an eating disorder.
Mhm.
And I don't know where that eating disorder would have escalated to if I hadn't had water polo, but I didn't have the ability to not eat and be a good polo player. So I had to take care of my body because
Right.
I wanted to play this sport. So I really want us to remember like that piece when it comes to youth athletics.
Mhm.
When it comes to professional athletics, when it comes to Olympic athletics, which is where I think we see this the most, when it comes to this piece of trans women participating in sports, two big things. Like you mentioned earlier, actually, everyone who does professional athletics, I would say, has a biological advantage as to why they do professional athletics, right? You talk about like Shaquille O'Neal. Well, he's giant. That's
Right.
why he's good at basketball, right? That's one of the reasons why he's good at basketball. Michael Phelps, who has just a default higher blood oxygen level. These two things don't qualify these men from sports, despite the fact that these are biological advantages that they have. And so it really is just getting weaponized against this one part of the population. And in reality, the actual validity of that justification is minimal. Because of something like medical transition, right? Where we see with our boys and with our men, when they start testosterone, yeah, they do increase their muscle mass. That is typically a trait that is attributed with testosterone. However, the reversal is for our trans women and our trans girls who start estrogen and testosterone blockers. One of the first things they note is a decrease in muscle mass and a decrease in overall strength. And so when we're talking about a trans woman who has been on testosterone blockers, who has been on estrogen for even just a couple of months, she's not going to have biological advantages of somebody who is still producing higher levels of testosterone. And so I think there's that piece as well of the biological advantage piece really is a moot argument when it comes to people who are accessing medical transition because of how medical transition works. The other thing I will say is if a person has been training in professional athletics for as long as they've been training, again, they're going to have an advantage, right? And so like if we were putting, a pro wrestler who has been wrestling for 12 years up against somebody who has never wrestled a day in their life, doesn't matter what either of these people's genders or assigned sex at births or the presentation of their natural hormones or hormones looks like, the person who's been wrestling for however many years is always going to win. And so when we're also talking about this piece of natural advantages between the sexes, between this idea of what is man and what is woman, I think that's also a really broad stroke that we're painting, because like Simone Biles is always going to be better at gymnastics than Michael Jordan, right? Regardless of biological sex, of gender identity, any of that.
Then let me ask you this: should we even have male-female sports?
This is a really complicated question, and I don't think there's a clear answer. Yeah. Obviously, as a non-binary person, I think that having gender-segregated sports is harmful to others like me, right? Harmful to the youth who are within my community. This is hard for us growing up to find our place in the world. We have non-binary people who will never medically transition. We have non-binary people who do medically transition. I don't want to sit on a women's team because the language inherently makes me uncomfortable surrounding that team. My partner is a non-binary person who is on HRT, who is taking hormones. Where are they going to go, right? As a person who's kind of in the middle. So personally, my belief is, I don't know. I think that there is validity to having distinction of athletes based on skill, right? We have, like, you talk about like a, what is the classification? I'm trying to think of like what the classification in the CIF is of like the different tiers of like high school athletes.
Like division or
yes, like your divisions.
Division
right?
1, division, yeah.
I'm like, what is the word? Yeah. So like divisions based on skill, right? That's absolutely a piece of it. And yeah, maybe you see that in certain divisions, it's more populated by certain body types. But I don't think body types are exclusive to certain sexes or genders. So there's no easy answer to this one. I think the best case scenario would be that we have, gender inclusive sports available to folks, and division of like professional athletics comes more from a place of skill rather than distinction based on gender. I mean, my dad was a baseball player growing up and throughout his adult life. And there was a women's team in his league because that women's team was playing at his level.
Yeah.
How many other women's teams would have had access to that league if they had had access to the same opportunity? So I don't think there's a clear answer. And I don't think I actually answered your question, but that's my answer.
I think that, I grew up playing sports too. So did my brother, my sister, and there's definitely value, especially for children, to play. So I think the overall consensus would be the more children we have playing sports, the better, because of the values it brings about. So
I want to just super quickly address this piece of that
Sure.
people are going to claim that they're a gender to be able to get access to things like locker rooms or to win at sports.
Yeah.
And that is a narrative that has been spewed for some time that has absolutely no validity whatsoever. There
Mhm.
is not someone who's just going to claim their gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth for the idea of winning a championship. That's not how it works.
Yeah. And so you're saying like basically you're saying nobody's doing that. Would that be correct?
Who is going to claim themselves a member of a marginalized population with
Mhm.
the possibility of winning an award, right?
Right.
People who are trans and non-binary are that. They're not
Yeah.
claiming to be that to get some kind of something on the other side of it.
Well, and I think there's also this
Mhm.
piece of, and we saw something similar happen with restroom access. If
Mhm.
there
Yes.
if there are individuals who are taking advantage of this system, right? I think there's a piece to be looked at of how much of that comes from the sensationalization of the topic and wanting
Yes.
to prove a point, right? So, like, if there's a cisgender man in the world, because again, this is typically how we think of these scenarios, it's a cis man pretending to be a woman in order to access things like a woman's bathroom or to win a women's championship.
Mhm.
If there is a person out there doing it, is that because it was their idea, or is it because it was an idea that was planted in them by transphobic rhetoric that, like, oh, this is something I could do? And if we had never made it a debate about whether or not trans women can participate in sports or if trans women can use women's restrooms, would this scenario have ever actually happened?
Yeah. It, let me, you know, can I know in certain parts of the country, it's prevalent to say like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and you can say even a majority of the country, but in other parts it is. Is that something that you think, like if somebody was to say, thank you, ma'am, whatever, is that, would you take that as offense or would you just understand that's their culture and what they're not doing it out of hate, but out of, they're actually trying to be nice and didn't mean to offend. But
Yeah.
is that offensive to say?
So complicated thoughts and feelings as a trans person, right? Where I
Mhm.
will say both of those things can coexist in my mind.
Okay.
My mom was raised in the South. My mom was raised in Ohio. And so
Yeah.
in Ohio, it is absolutely yes, ma'am, yes, sir.
Yeah.
My mom worked front desk at a hospital reception. And so, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. When I came out as non binary, one of the first questions she asked me was, should I still be saying that? And the answer is no. Yes, ma'am, yes, sir, ma'am. These are kind of out of date, especially when it comes to this piece of they're making a lot of broad assumptions about what gender presents as. I have a friend who has a very low pitched voice, a cis
Mhm.
woman who has a very low pitched voice and gets sirred on the phone a lot. And that's exhausting to her because she's like, I'm not a man.
Right.
And so I think, yeah, it is something that we do need to be phasing out. I can recognize where there is that cultural piece to it, though, and I give
Mhm.
people a lot of room to make that mistake when it comes to
Mhm.
me in particular, because again, I can only control myself.
Right.
But even though I can justify it and I can say this is probably how the person was raised, a lot of the times we make assumptions based on a person's age. Um, it still hurts.
Yeah. And in terms of the bathroom issue, I did want to touch a little bit more onto that. Um, yeah, I don't ever see that being a problem. Like, there a friend of mine, and I should we become friends, acquaintances. We're more acquaintances. We've definitely become friends over time. Didn't know he had a trans son until recently. He started telling me about his trans son. And we were talking about the bathroom issue and stuff like that. And um, one thing he said was kind of what you said is nobody just becomes trans or says they're trans in essence or uses non-binary. There was a whole process that took
Yes.
place to get
Yes.
there, So it's not like you wake up in the morning and go, I want to be trans. There's this huge process to get to that, stage in life.
There is. We talk in
Mhm.
terms of it's less of a coming out and a more of an inviting in, right?
Mhm.
No matter the age of the person, generally they spend a lot of time turning inward to really discover who they are. Maybe they're doing internet searches, talking to other trans people over the internet, checking in with, folks if they're in school age and high school, their clubs, that kind of stuff. And it may take somebody years before they get to the place where they're ready to tell another person. And so when someone shares this information with us, making sure that we're keeping in check that piece of this isn't new information for them,
Mhm.
right? Nobody's coming and telling you the first time they think about it, typically, oh,
Right.
I think I may be trans. There's a lot of self discovery that happens. And so we should not be dismissing, in particular for our adolescents, that we know better than they do who they are.
Now, and would it be like, let's just say I see somebody, a guy, a male, walking into a woman's restroom, and how should I? And if I think that person's intent, and this is the hard part. I think if I have a daughter, like if I have my 6-year, I don't have a daughter, but if I had a 6-year-old, 7-year-old daughter in that bathroom, and I saw a grown ass man go in there, I'd probably just instinctively probably have a problem with that. I don't know if I would go right in there and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Or, I think that's where I personally have a little bit of a hard time with that. And now if I can clearly tell it's maybe a man transitioning to a woman who's really that's who they are, I get it, but and I don't know the intentions. And if he's just going to throw out, oh, well, I'm transgender, even though he's just throwing it out as an excuse. Is that a valid concern? Should I be worried? How do I approach that?
So here's a really cool thing that would totally alleviate a lot of that particular scenario around like, well, what about my young daughter who's in there?
Yeah.
Eliminate gendered restrooms. Like, it may seem
Okay.
like a really bold call, but like my dad had that awkward position of, he had myself and my twin sister. And
Mhm.
when we're out together at 7, 8 years old, well, I'm too
Yeah.
old to be going into the men's
Yeah.
bathroom with him,
Right.
but
Yeah.
he's not comfortable sending me into the women's bathroom by myself.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get rid of that problem. All gender restrooms where a parent can go in and take their child without worrying about it. We should be able to expect privacy in private spaces. And so something like a restroom, the way that the US does restrooms is really bizarre because there's not really that privacy. And there should be. We should have the full cubicle, right? There shouldn't be those
Right.
big gaps where a person can
Yeah.
just peek in on you. And so I think really eliminate the trans piece to this conversation in its entirety. Our system of restrooms is kind of archaic and it doesn't really work for all family structures, people who need extra assistance. My sister is a wheelchair user, and like the difficulty that she has accessing restrooms as a person in a chair, like it's incredible. And it would be so much easier
Mhm.
if she could bring someone with her to help support her in getting into that position. But she doesn't always have someone of the same gender who can help and support her. So I don't know that this is so much a trans conversation or a trans issue. I can see how it's been spun into a trans piece, but
Yeah.
I think really what it is that our restrooms are just poorly designed, and could be doing better to serve all of us and not just any one population.
Gotcha. If you don't mind, Evan, would you share a little bit about your experience on how you kind of got to where you're at in terms of your journey, like maybe as a child, how did, in your mind, how did you even, I grew up in the 80s. So there was no concept of even, when you're growing up as even gay wasn't even something until I was in high school, I didn't even know what that meant. So, what was your journey? What were your feelings like? How did you realize, what, I don't that there was this concept of I don't even have to identify as either one. And,
Yeah. So, all the way back to adolescence, right?
Okay.
And I have the ability to call on certain moments, but I think we can just make a general statement through like what child development looks like of like kids don't really have a gender, right? Pre-puberty, kids are just kind of like things. They go off and they do the things that they want to do, and this concept of gender doesn't really start existing for them just yet. And when I was in that place, I can recall having very specific moments of, I really wanted people to not know if I was a boy or a girl. That was my big thing, is I wanted to look in a way, I wanted to navigate the world in a way where people just didn't know. That was really exciting for me. And that was reflected a lot in my play. And like I said, I have an identical twin. And so it was very easy for me to compare the two of us growing up, and her trajectory looked really different than my trajectory. My sister wants to be a mom. My sister wants to get married. My sister was very much that person, and none of that ever really resonated with me. And then it actually didn't come up again for a very long time. I was always really uncomfortable with like puberty and the fact that people were starting to like assign gender to me. But it wasn't until I was in high school that I had access to any of this language, because even in the early 2010s, there still wasn't access to this language. So finally, I did find the word transgender. And then from there, I actually met a couple of trans students at my school, including one person who was also non-binary identifying. And I was opened up to the idea of like, well, I don't have to be a girl. How novel, how cool. And that kind of expanded my understanding of what gender looks like. And for me, it very much was this internal conversation. And like Kathy said, it took years. I came out to myself at 15. I didn't come out to my parents until I was 21. And so years. But when I was exploring what gender means and really looking at gender at its root, gender is a social construct created by other people that I don't subscribe to. And I don't feel like it has any stake or value in my particular life. I am happiest to just be myself. And that comes from the language that I have found to express that identity and this deviation from gender norms and this deviation from a male-female binary. So that's a little bit about how I found the language and how the language resonated with me. And what my non-binary has looked like has changed a lot over the years. Like I said, I grew up in a pretty closed down culture when it came to expression of gender nonconformity. And so I thought that in order to be non-binary, I had to present a certain way. We see a lot of non-binary people in the media who are typically assigned female at birth, are typically white, are typically thin, and present what we may call androgynously. And that's how I thought I had to present in order to be non-binary. And as I've grown up, that has changed a lot. I have finally started like exploring with makeup again and painting my nails and wearing dresses. And none of this would have been accessible to me when I first came out. So my journey is still going on. I'm still discovering myself and my authenticity in my gender. And I hope it never ends.
Yeah. And now, so if I was going to look from my perspective, like, is there something wrong if I do, like somebody, like if you have your ways of viewing the world and I have my ways of viewing who I am, like, to me, like, I feel like I'm a man. There's certain things that are innate to me. My wife kind of, she feels the same about her being a woman. This is what she feels. We have kind of certain roles in our relationship that kind of works for us. My wife's also a social worker as well. So, but at the same time, even with that said, even with my worldview, in a sense, I'm also open to other people's worldview. And accepting. And, for me, I want to live in a society where you can be whoever you want. You know, I
Yes.
think that's important. I don't, and your rights are just as protected as mine, and you're no different than, we're no different than each other, regardless, especially under the law. Um, but if I do have a somewhat different viewpoint on gender, but I'm okay with you living your life the way you want to live life and view things the way you want to view things, is that kind of a happy medium? Or
Yeah, I mean, so here's my general thing with it, right? Gender is super fake and made up, except for the people who it's real for.
okay,
And if gender is real for you, who am I to take that away from you? Right? Like that's your life.
Mhm.
I think as long as we're being respectful of each other and
Yeah.
we're addressing each other with respect and integrity, we're doing the things to continue to move our society to a place where you can do you and I can do me, and we're no different under the law. And yeah, live your own life. That does mean, not falling into a trap of, well, I don't need to like disclose my pronouns because everyone else can tell I'm a man, because that's just not true, right? We can't fall into that trap of thinking that that's me living my own life and that's you living your own life, because that does inherently impact the lives of others, not just trans folks, but again, gender nonconforming folks. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, like some people believe in astrology, some people
Right.
believe in conspiracy theories, some people believe in gender.
Right.
And who am I to take away the things that bring another person comfort and joy?
I think the important thing is to recognize that line between I have my beliefs, but when my beliefs start taking away your rights
Mhm.
is when there's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's where we are in our country right now, is there's a lot of people that are trying to take away the rights of the transgender community, and to eradicate the transgender community, that it then becomes problematic.
Got it. Yeah. And then do you ever think that some of these issues may be taken a little too far? I'll give you an example with pronouns and with when I was when I was born, I remember growing up, my background, my heritage, my mom's from Mexico, and my dad's Mexican Native American. But growing up, I've been Mexican, I've been Mexican American, I've been Hispanic, I've been Latino, and now I'm Latinx. And then or identify. This is what, and it's kind of what people have kind of I've been Chicano. This is what other people put on me. And then right now it's Latinx, and then next year it could be something else. Is there a time where these kind of labels maybe go too far, or is that something that's just part of society where we're kind of that's just that's life, I guess, as things change. I mean,
So I love that you specifically brought up how the Mexican American population and how the Mexican population has been referred to in the United States, because that's where I have the most understanding. My partner is Latina, my partner is Mexican and indigenous. And so we've talked a lot about this language in regards to, am I Chicano? Am I Mexican? Am I indigenous? How do I fill out my census? Right. And we've had a lot of that conversation as well. And here's the thing, at the end of the day, the language you personally use for yourself, you decide what that is. No one can take that away from you. Just because my partner uses Latine, right? Instead of Latinx or Latino or Latina, there's the E, Latine. Just because my partner is Latine doesn't take away that you may be Latino or Chicano or Mexican, however you want to identify yourself. When it comes to referring to all people and all people within a community, we want to make our language as inclusive as everybody within that community as possible. That's why we say, like my fellow Americans, instead of like, US citizens or white Americans, right? We want to make our language as broad as possible. And so when we're referring to the greater population of people with Latin American heritage or Central and South American heritage, the conversation is so much broader than just like gender politics, because there's also this piece of the impact of colonization on that language. I mean, like Latino in its root comes from Latin, right? And this assumption of, in particular, Spanish population within Central and South America. but like that's not something that people resonate with. Hispanic had the same barriers. So like the TLDR, the like summary of it all is the language you use for yourself is your own. And don't let anyone take that away from you. That's yours. Somebody else using different words for themselves doesn't take that away from you. And if we're trying to reach as many people as possible, why wouldn't we want to tweak our language to be more inclusive of that?
Got it.
Because somebody else is Latina, that doesn't prevent you from being Latino.
Yeah.
Because somebody else is Latine doesn't prevent somebody else from being Latina or Latino. So that's where that is.
Got it. Perfect. I'm going to be, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I've really appreciated this conversation. How can, if somebody's watching this and they either want to reach out to you for whatever reason, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, the easiest is just going to our website, transfamilysos.org. And all of the information is there on all of our services. There are no fees for our services. So we really work diligently to make sure that the barriers to access to this really life-affirming care and services are available for all families across the country.
Perfect. Well, and then I'm also going to, I'll put a link for your website on this.
Excellent.
Like I said, this has actually been very helpful for me. And I really appreciate it. And I hope that the people watching, they can pick up something else and continue this conversation so that, we live in a country of many different people.
Yes.
And, the more that we can have these conversations, I think, and we can learn from each other and have a dialogue, I think the better we'll be.
Agreed. That piece of really learning from each other and honoring and respecting that everybody is different is really vitally important right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And, if you ever need anything from me, let me know. And thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It was great to have this opportunity.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.